The crash course today. We have Teel from Boerum Apparel, which is at the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, and he'll be presenting to you.
Thanks. All right, hi everyone. My name is Teel. I run a company called Boerum Apparel. And yes, we're a member of the Brooklyn Fashion and Design Accelerator, which is a wonderful incubator program that Pratt runs out of the old Pfizer building in Williamsburg. If you haven't been down there, I would highly recommend it. There are a lot of really cool events. It's a very cool space. You should definitely come and check us out. I apologize for my voice. Winter is over, but it left me a parting gift, and I have this terrible cold. But hopefully it will hold out through this entire talk. So today I'm basically going to guide you through the incredibly complex and convoluted world of apparel supply chains. This is how clothing gets made, not just in the US, but all around the world. And I'm going to talk a lot about a concept called traceability, which most of you are probably familiar with. But this is basically the ability to track how a product is made all the way through its production process back to the original raw materials. When you have a truly traceable product, you can tell who made it, where it was made, how it was made, and what it was made out of. And this concept of traceability, it really goes hand in hand with sustainability, because imagine if you're a clothing company that wants to adopt sustainable practices. It's very difficult to do that if you don't have information about how your products are being made at any step of the process. If you're a consumer and you want to purchase sustainably produced clothing, again, you need information about how these things were made, whether the practices that were used were sustainable in a social and environmental way. So sustainability and traceability really go hand in hand. Unfortunately, in the apparel industry today, the way that it's currently organized, it's very difficult to trace goods back. So today I'm really going to be talking about why that is, why it's difficult to take an end product and figure out where it's coming from and how it's made. And this isn't just an issue for consumers. You may think that J. Crew or Ralph Lauren has all the information about where the products are coming from. They're just not telling you. That's actually not the case. It's basically just as hard for those companies to figure out where their products are coming from as it is for us as consumers to figure out where they're coming from. So this is a cotton apparel supply chain. This is everything it takes to get from a cotton seed to a finished garment. Down at the bottom, you've got a farm which produces the raw cotton. The farm sends that raw cotton to a gin, and the gin removes the seeds from the fiber. The fiber is sent along to a spinning mill, which turns the fiber into a yarn. A textile mill knits or weaves that yarn into a finished textile, so a bolt of fabric. And then a cut and sew factory cuts a pattern out of that fabric, sews it together into what you would recognize as a finished piece of clothing, and sends that finished piece of clothing along to a retail brand, which usually designs that clothing, commissions it, and sells it to the consumer either directly or through wholesale. So all of this is necessary basically to get from a cotton seed to a finished garment. But I think generally when people think of apparel supply chains, really what they think of is this. So this is the cut and sew factory. When the media pays attention to how clothing is made, where it comes from, generally this is what they're thinking about. You all probably remember in 2013 there was something called the Rana Plaza collapse, where a building in Bangladesh fell over, and it contained several of these factories, these cut and sew factories. About 1,000 people died, 2,000 people were injured, and the media paid attention to that for about 6 weeks. That's almost the most media coverage I've seen paid to the apparel supply chain in my lifetime anyway. Back in the 90s, there was a lot of attention paid to sweatshops, a lot of it focused around Nike. I'm not sure if you guys remember that. I have vague memories of that. Companies also focus on this step of the process when they talk about the apparel supply chain. So when they adopt labor policies, generally the people that those policies apply to are these people, the people in the cut and sew factory. When they brag about responsible production, what they tend to be bragging about is how they treat these people, their working conditions, their wages, how they're managed. And I think even as consumers, we tend to focus on this step as well. just because we've had so much exposure to it through the media and through the companies. When we think about buying ethical clothing or sustainable clothing, socially, we think about buying sweatshop free. And that's really a reference to this step in the production process. So why does the cut and sew factory get all this attention when it's really just a small part of the total production process? Well, I think part of the reason is that it's really photogenic. It's very interesting to look at. Another reason might be that it's clearly a part of the apparel supply chain. You can really easily identify it as a clothing factory because there's sewing machines sitting there. They're bits and pieces of partially made clothing, sweatshirts, pants, whatever they happen to be making in that factory. But another big reason why all the attention gets paid up there at the very top of the apparel supply chain is that it's almost impossible to trace a finished piece of clothing back to the lower parts of the supply chain. So if you take any given brand, they could tell you who cuts and sews their garments. They probably don't, because in a lot of cases, it's not all that pretty. But they could, if they wanted to, give you that information. Almost no brands could tell you who is spinning the yarn that goes into their garments. They couldn't even if they wanted to. They just don't have that access to that information, which kind of forces us to pay more attention to the parts of the supply chain that are associated with the brands, that we can connect our pieces of clothing that we buy to. So what's the reason for this lack of traceability? Because that's really what this is. This is the traceability problem in the apparel supply chain. A big part of this is just how the industry is organized. So some industries are what we call vertically integrated industries. And that means that the company that's branding the product controls basically the entire supply chain, the entire production process. They own or closely control every step in this process. And as a result, it's really easy to trace products back to the original origins and the raw materials they were made out of and through every step, because it's all done in-house. The retail brand, the brand that's selling it to you, owns whoever's making the raw materials, so they can tell you who that is. They usually don't as well, but they could if they wanted to. But this does not describe the apparel industry. The apparel industry is the opposite of this. It is highly fractured and highly specialized, and each step in the production process is covered by an independent company that really just does that one step. And the problem is that these companies don't really talk to each other very much. Up at the top, the retail brand will talk to the cut and sew factory, and they may talk to the textile mill. But below that point, each company basically just talks to the companies that are immediately next to it. So the textile mill will know who the spinning mill is, but it won't know who the gin is. The spinning mill will know who the gin is, but not who the farm is. And the only person who really knows who the farm is the gin. And you can kind of see from this, there would be a really elaborate game of telephone for the retail brand to figure out who the farms are that are producing their cotton. And this is actually a simplification, because a lot of these steps can also be taken care of by brokers and exchanges, which just adds additional degrees of separation into this entire process. So it makes it even more complicated for the retail brand to figure out what's going on down in this lower end of the supply chain. And if you think that this looks complicated, I just invite you to Google image search cotton supply chain, and what you'll come up with something that looks a little bit more like this. And this actually doesn't even take into consideration the retail brand, so there'd be a lot more circles and arrows on this. And this also is a simplification of the actual industry. There are a lot more players in the industry than are shown up here. So it's basically a mess. It's a very circuitous path between the person who sells you your clothing and the various steps that actually make that clothing. But that's not the only issue here. So there are other things that are standing in the way of the traceability that we're talking about. Spinning mills, for instance, they don't buy from just one farm and just one gin. Cotton is a commodity and it can be mixed together. And spinning mills are buying from several farms and several gins and mixing that together when they make their yarn. So any given spool of yarn may have cotton from several farms in it. And then on top of that, the set of farms and gins that are feeding into a particular spinning mill are changing all the time based on who's on the market, who has product, who's selling for the lowest price. So this is all getting mixed up, put together into the yarn, which then gets sent to the textile mill. But the same issue stands for the yarn as well, because yarn is also a commodity. So there are several yarns going to each textile mill that are getting woven or knit into this fabric that goes into your finished garment. And those are constantly changing all the time as well, based on who's in the market, whose prices are lowest, who they've got contacts with. So imagine just for a second that a retail brand can get through this whole mess and get down to the lower ends of its supply chain. What's it gonna find? It's gonna find a large and constantly changing set of farms sending cotton into a large and constantly changing set of mills that then is feeding up into the higher parts of the supply chain. And that's just not that useful in answering the question of where our clothing is coming from. It's a very confusing answer. It's a very fluid answer. It's hard to actually just pinpoint where, where a particular shirt was made or where a particular pair of pants were made. All right, so this lower end of the supply chain is just murky at best. Why do we care about that? We're a company. What's down there that we want to manage? We're a consumer. We're looking. We're in the market for a T-shirt. What's down there that we would actually care about? It turns out that there's a lot that goes on down here. Almost, I would say, most of the interesting stuff in the supply chain in terms of sustainability and ethical production. So this is a sustainability conference, and I'm sure that a lot of you closely connect the concept of sustainability to carbon footprint. That seems to be pretty popular these days, mitigating global warming. Well, about 2/3 of the total carbon footprint happens at the lower end of the supply chain in that kind of murky area that we can't trace back to. But this can be managed. If you produce with best practices, depending on how you use your land, how you use your transportation, how you power your factories, you can actually cut the carbon footprint down here about in half. So companies that care about sustainable production, specifically with respect to carbon footprint, they want to know what's going on down here. And frankly, they want influence over the companies that are feeding into their finished products. So they can say, hey, adopt these best practices, cut your carbon footprint. But carbon footprint isn't the only issue down here, nor is environmental degradation in general. We all know, just through the media exposure about the abusive and unsustainable labor practices up at the top of the supply chain in the sweatshop. But actually the most egregious labor practices are down at the farm level. So cotton is a slave crop. And it was back in the 19th century, and it still is today. I think most people are sort of surprised to hear that. This woman is not enslaved, but these children are slaves. They live in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is the 6th largest producer of cotton in the entire world. They're the 5th largest exporter of cotton in the world. And they enslave about 5% of their population every year in their cotton harvest. A good deal of those people enslaved are school-age children who get pulled out of school and work for no pay out in the cotton fields. India also has a huge slavery problem. So India is the world's #1 producer of cotton, and it's the #2 exporter of cotton to the world markets. India enslaves about 1% of its population, and it doesn't really do it seasonally. These are actually much more like static slaves. They live large periods of their lives in slavery. And a good portion of that 1% of their population, which is a huge number, is focused in their cotton industry, either on the farms, in the gins, or in the spinning mills. And that also focuses quite a bit on children, because especially with the GM cotton that's being grown in India now, it requires actually a very kind of delicate touch to fertilize and pick and clean. And children are very good at that. So we've got India and we've got Uzbekistan, major producers of cotton. Together, these two contribute about 30% of the cotton on the global market, which means that it's very likely that this cotton is in all of our closets right now. And I think that this is really where the need for traceability in the apparel supply chain comes into focus. So I don't want cotton that comes from forced labor on a farm or in a mill to be benefited by my dollars. I don't want to support that. But it's very difficult for me to make informed choices about what I'm buying in order to avoid slavery situations if I don't know who the farms were that were feeding into the t-shirts that I buy. And the same thing goes for companies too. I don't think companies really want to be affiliated with slavery. It's not just that it's morally abhorrent and socially and politically unsustainable. Systems like this will fall apart at some point in the near future. So it's not just that level of unsustainability, that social unsustainability. It's also that there's huge brand risk to this. So you don't want to be the clothing brand that some investigative journalist digs into and connects to slavery. That's a big issue for your business. So the need for traceability is really there because we've got issues like this lurking down in the murky parts of the lower end of the supply chain. But the way that the conventional supply chain is organized totally prevents us from getting information about what's going on down here. So what do we do about it? Well, there's some companies out there that have been building direct relationships with every part of the production process so that they know what's going on at every level. They know how things are produced, they know how land is being used, they know how workers are being treated all throughout the entire production process. My company, Boerum Apparel, has done this with the wool supply chain, and we've partnered with a company that's done this in the cotton industry as well. It's really not an easy thing to do because farms and gins and spinning mills are not in the yellow pages. They're really difficult to track down. And then once you do track them down, you need to figure out whether they're actually practicing best practices, whether they're open to having you influence how they're doing things at all, whether they're open to kind of reporting to you on an ongoing basis. So you have to find them first. You have to figure out whether they're right for you, whether you can work with them. And then you have to convince them to work with you as well. And these are people who are used to selling all of what they produce to a single buyer. And we're talking, tens of tons, 100 tons in one go to one buyer on the open market through that conventional supply chain that we just looked at. Whether it's a clearinghouse or a gin, they're used to these giant sales. And if you walk up to them as a small business and you say, I want to buy a couple 100 pounds of what you're making, or I want to buy 1,000 pounds of what you're making, they sort of balk at first because that seems like, just pocket change to them. But after a while, they tend to get really excited about it because the people who are down at this end of the supply chain are not used to exposure. But a lot of them, especially the ones that aren't involved in the bad practices, they're really excited about what they're doing. They're making really good fiber if they're cotton or wool producers. And they're doing it in a very beautiful way. And they like their workers. They treat them well. They're treating their land well. They've got these operations that they're just really proud of. And they start realizing that when they work with a company that builds these sorts of direct connections, that sort of information flows out to the consumer and they get exposure. So the people who are buying shirts know exactly where they're coming from. They can look at photos of the farm. So this is the farmer that we work with in New Zealand, who's a third generation, incredibly proud merino farmer with spectacular practices. This is one of 2 organically certified plots of land in New Zealand for sheep grazing. And this guy has won the New Zealand Fleece of the Year award. That's a thing. There's a Fleece of the Year award in New Zealand. He's won it 3 times. And he's really proud. You go into his shearing shed and it's just covered in medals. So, he realizes the people who are buying sweaters will connect it to his sheep, to his raising practices. We'll see pictures like this, and that will reflect well on him. It will give him exposure for his life's work, basically. This is the farm that we work with in the Carolinas to source cotton from. Again, this is a 2nd generation family farm. They've been experimenting with, they actually brought a lot of cotton production back to the Carolinas after it was eradicated early on by a pest called the boll weevil. And they've been working on establishing organic cotton in the Carolinas too, which is incredibly difficult to do based on the climate. So these are people who are very into what they do. They think hard about it. They want exposure. And someone, someone like me comes along, or someone like the company we work with comes along and basically says, well, we'll help you tell this story to the world. And they really like that because they know that we'll go out and we'll push them. And we put together things like this. This is a video, but you can't see it.
Get people engaged. On the planet. What's our responsibility? I'm Eric Henry, President of CSDS. We're based in Boerum, North Carolina.
All right, let's try that again.
People want to know where the food comes from, and we meet the farmer. We want to do the same thing with apparel. We want to get people engaged. What is our impact on the planet? What's our responsibility? I'm Eric Henry, President of CSDS. We're based in Boerum, North Carolina, and we're a custom wholesale t-shirt company. We've been on this journey since the mid-90s to be a different company. A company that looks at not only the bottom line, but also impact the planet, impact people. 6 years ago, we launched Cotton Carolina. We go dirt to shirt. We're doing about 600 miles. We've got about 500 jobs. We're doing a completely transparent supply chain. We connect the consumer to the farmer. We connect them to the dinner, spinner, knitter, finisher, cut and sew, yes and none. We're not a perfect company. Sustainability is a journey, not a destination. But there are no secrets either. It's been a tough journey. It's been a roller coaster. It's been a rock journey. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the contribution you're making back to the community to make it a better life for all of us.
So you can actually go and visit all of these people if you want. You can go online, you can find their contact information, you can plan a road trip, you can go visit them, they're very nice, they'll talk to you, you can ask them all the questions you want to. So I'm actually gonna wrap up, but as I wrap up, I just wanna ask two favors of you. So as consumers, first off, if this is compelling to you, this idea of instilling traceability in apparel supply chains, please just call your favorite brands and ask them where their clothing comes from. Ask them, you can even ask them what country their farms are in. And they won't be able to give you an answer unless they're really unusual. But that sort of demand for this information builds over time. And it's possible to build traceability into the conventional supply chain to overcome the obstacles that I pointed out here. So if we're out there and we're asking these questions, companies will start figuring out ways to answer them. They've done it in a lot of the food industry. They've done it in some of the electronic industry. They can do it here, but they basically need us as consumers to be out there demanding this information. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you like what we're doing, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram, like us on Facebook. This is how we know that this concept is compelling to people, that they want this information. Because it's actually not obvious, and a lot of people don't find this terribly compelling. So if you do, reach out, let us know. This is how we know to keep going with this, to push it farther, and to keep on building these sorts of relationships and pushing them out into the world to you guys. All right, so that's all I've got. I blazed through this. It usually takes me half an hour. I did it in like 25 minutes. I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Ask me anything, personal or otherwise. Yep.
Are you using any information data to trace all this performance, or because there's a lot there? There's a lot of information that needs to manage. Is there any particular data system that you use?
We're so small right now that we don't have large data sets to work with. And we can really be hands-on with management. We don't need to generalize in any way. We can be hyper-specific in the way that we deal with our suppliers and the relationships we have. So we haven't needed to do that. As we grow, I think we will have to. There's another great company that has a very high degree of traceability in its supply chain called Icebreaker that makes performance wear, mostly out of wool as well. And they do have pretty sophisticated tracking codes and software that measures production and inputs and tracks producers. And I think that that's sort of the model you have to adopt when you grow on this scale. Definitely what we're doing, building direct relationships, is limiting, and it's hard to scale up significantly on this model. I mean, there's a reason why other companies buy out of large commodity exchanges and auction houses. And that's because they need a huge flow of material coming in. And a farm may have a bad year and may not produce enough to send cotton to Zara or H&M. I mean, Zara and H&M produce enough cotton to keep a lot of farms in business. But they want flexibility to switch based on who's offering the lowest prices, who's got the best quality, that sort of thing. So there's scalability issues in here, but they're not insurmountable. I mean, Icebreaker's a rather large company that has a high degree of traceability. And I think that there would be ways to instill the traceability even through clearinghouses and traders that would allow you to manage the supply chain in a much more intuitive way. And I think that's really why I asked you guys to reach out to the brands and ask them for this information, because there are solutions that they could implement that would be highly based on large data that would turn the conventional supply chain into a very transparent and traceable supply chain.
I have a question regarding sort of 4 examples you had of traceability practices seem to be more in certain countries, and then the companies that you found that were producing portfolios in New Zealand and the US and Western countries. If you wanted to build a company like yours that was more transparent, I mean, is that coincidental? Do you think it's beneficial to be working with American-based companies or European-based companies and trying to go, say, to India and trying to get traceability on?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can definitely build a very traceable supply chain out of a country like Egypt or India if you're working with cotton. I think, and frankly, I think that that's almost a better, more responsible thing to do than sourcing everything out of the US, because you kind of get a double whammy of instilling responsible practices in the industry, and also you get development dollars into a developing country, which is fantastic. You run into some issues, though, with a lot of these countries. So they have very low labor and environmental regulatory standards. And that's one issue. So even good practices there might be a lot worse than very baseline basic practices in a well-established developed country like the US or New Zealand. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that there are a lot of barriers to basically auditing your suppliers there. There are language barriers, there are trust barriers. Some developing economies, it's very difficult to figure out whether the person who's selling you a product or a material is actually the one who's producing it. There are really elaborate subcontracting networks in a lot of these countries. So you need to kind of implement sophisticated tracking systems if you're going to do that. It's much easier, again, we're kind of limited because we're a very small company at this point. It's much easier to plug into a traceable system that you can have a lot of faith in, that has great standards already there, that you don't have to go and demand the standards. They're just already there in a country like the US and New Zealand. So, I think if our volume increases a lot, I would love to go and basically fund an entire, farm in India or factory in China that's basically got, the gold standard of practices in those countries that, are at the, that have living wage standards for their labor, that have the highest environmental standards out there. And really prove that in these countries that sort of have better reputations in a lot of ways, you can do that. And you can flow the development dollars in there as well. But it's just easier to do it in the US or New Zealand. And right now, with limited resources, that's what we chose to do.
How does certification work?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really fantastic question, because that's one way that you could tackle this, is basically a certification like GOTS, which is the Global Organic Textile Standard, basically says that you don't know exactly who's in your supply chain, but you know that all of them comply with a set of criteria. And that you might not need like name traceability. You might not need to know the name of your farmer, as long as you know that your farmer is using really good standards. I think that there are a few issues with certifications that really push me away from using them. The first is that it's much less effective on the consumer end for transmitting information than this true kind of visual traceability is, because there are good and there are bad organic textile standards out there. Or really most certifications out there right now are organic. There's also, Fair Trade has recently released textile and clothing fiber standards. But I think consumers have a really difficult time picking apart what's meaningful and what's not meaningful. They see a stamp on a package, they don't actually know what it means. A lot of these certifications don't actually have teeth to them. They're very close to just kind of rubber stamping conventional practices. And even the ones that are good might be surprising if you actually dig into what the criteria are. So for instance, fair trade, I think everyone thinks of fair trade as certifying great labor practices, but really what it does is it just guarantees a per pound premium on a commodity. So it says, you're selling us coffee on the open market for 70 cents a pound. I have no idea whether that's accurate. But we guarantee a 30-cent premium on each pound of coffee that you sell us. And that doesn't tell you anything about how the people who are actually picking the cotton are being treated. It just tells you how much money is going into the pocket of the farm owner. So the first issue with certifications is that I think that it's a very nebulous area, and its ability to actually transmit useful information is sort of questionable. The second big issue with certification is that there's a real compliance issue there. A lot of certifications, like GOTS, for instance, you can get a GOTS stamp on your product, which frankly I think is the best clothing certification out there. It's really spectacular. It involves environmental standards, labor standards. It's really great. But you can get a GOTS certification if you're using 70% organic certified cotton in your product. So that means that 30% of the cotton in there could come from India or Uzbekistan. And it probably is, frankly, because if you're incurring the additional costs to get the really gold standard cotton, you're probably trying to cut costs elsewhere. So there's you get a lot of non-compliant cotton coming into the system because the certification thresholds aren't at 100%. But then also down at the farm level, GOTS can't be on a farm 24/7, 365 days a year, making sure that they're complying with those standards. They can't be constantly walking through these supply chains. Their auditing process probably takes a look at the people they've certified maybe once every 2 years. It might be more frequently than that, but that's what I would guess, something along those lines. And there's a lot of room for non-compliance in there. If you want to game the system, you can. So certifications are a step forward, and I think that they're a good step forward. but there are a lot of holes in them. And I think really what we need is a much more intuitive way to connect consumers with what's going on. And I think telling these sorts of stories is sort of a more effective way of monitoring that supply chain and making sure that there's nothing terrible happening in there. So, yeah. So the first question is, do we have a plan for scaling up, given that we've built this sort of very specific supply chain? And the second question was how large companies like Zara could build the direct relationships that we build. So in answering your first question, we have a lot of room in our supply chain to scale before we hit a ceiling. We could probably, grow by a factor of 100 to 200 before we ran out of capacity in the relationships that we've built. So there's a lot of time before we kind of hit our scaling ceiling. And at that point, if we grew to that size, we would have enough resources to, build additional and monitor additional relationships. And there are a lot of people out there who are doing, who are growing fiber, who are processing fiber, who are making clothes with really great practices. So I think there's a lot of scalability in there. I don't think you could easily scale to the size of like Inditex or one of these huge clothing conglomerates doing stuff in a responsible way. But right now there's enough capacity to build a relatively large company that just uses the people who are doing things in an incredible way. And then once you get to that size, I think you're big enough to probably establish your own farms and processing centers and vertically integrate, frankly, as well. So I think that's really, that would be wonderful if we ever ran into that scalability problem. I hope we do someday, but it's a ways off for us. To answer your second question, I don't think Zara could do what we're doing. And that's sort of linked to the first question. They couldn't build direct relationships and operate at their scale. I think, kind of coming back to the first question, you would need to build a pretty creative system of management and data processing to more or less be able to communicate this information through to customers on the scale of something like Zara or H&M. So I think that's another incredible challenge that should be tackled at some point. Again, it has been done in much of the food industry. It's statutorily required in parts of the US food system to have that degree of traceability to track basically disease outbreaks. So you can do this, but it would take a lot of thought, probably a consultant or a company focusing solely on that. Yeah.
Just a comment earlier, you mentioned that I think you said you'd almost prefer to partner with somebody in China or Egypt. I personally like the fact that you're partnering with farmers in Carolina, so I think it's good for them.
Oh, thank you. I think it's wonderful too, and it's really wonderful to have the people whose jobs you're supporting in your backyard and go and meet them and know them, and build the the U.S. community and the U.S. Textile industry as well.
Because I think if we have an economy solely based on services,
yeah,
it's a little harder to,
sure. But I think I think it's a choice between several really good options. I think it would be wonderful to further build the U.S. textile industry to support people in our backyard. I also think it's wonderful to go into areas that are relatively impoverished and pay people 10, 20 times what they would be making otherwise, and really get them established and on their feet. Do it in an environmentally responsible way as sort of a proof of concept that it's viable in those sorts of markets. I think both of those things are spectacular. I'd be really honored to be involved in either one. So I'm really happy with how we do it now. But I do think it'd be also amazing to go into a country that's developing. So way up there in the back.
Kind of reminded of recent legislation that allows a lot of chickens to be farmed in America that's sent over to China. Are you encountering some pretty horrific, strangely directional things like that, or are you seeing that legislation going in that direction?
Well, there's wonky stuff like that in the apparel industry. The U.S. and it's directly analogous. The U.S. is one of the top 5 exporters. I think the U.S. might actually be like number 3 of the top 5 cotton exporting countries in the world. We produce a ton of cotton in the U.S. still, and that's because our farms are very mechanized. They're not really dependent on much labor. Those bales of cotton tend to get sent overseas to get processed, cut and sewn into garments and sent right back to us. So you might have a T-shirt that's traveled, all the way, literally all the way around the world before it gets to you, and it may have started in your backyard. And that's what a lot of these people down in Carolina is sort of, that's what they dwell on is we grow this cotton, we send it, 12, 15,000 miles, and it comes right back to us and it's sitting in our shops, and that's crazy. And we want to, keep it local. As far as legislation goes, I think that the world is on a general trajectory towards free trade. We've got a new free trade agreement in the works right now. I think we're probably going to see just more and more of that kind of wonky movement of materials around, as long as we have these giant discrepancies in labor prices. So yeah, I think we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more of it in the textile and in the garment industry, just like we're going to see more of it in crazy places like chicken nuggets too.
This is really interesting.
Thank you.
One thing that I noticed in the supply chain laid out is that there are things that were missing were warehousing, distribution, and shipping.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and what your experience is, because that's an environment as well as increasingly
They do, yeah. And I would like to pay more attention to that in what we do. Just to kind of illustrate what you're saying, I think that this is a spectacular point. At one point, we've also been considering using U.S. grown wool as well in our supply chain. And a lot of that is grown out west in Oregon or Colorado. And if you look at the carbon footprint of the truck ride from Oregon to New York, it's actually something crazy like 2 or 3 times the carbon footprint of shipping stuff from New Zealand. So you wind up with these, there's really interesting stuff in transportation there. Again, I think we started basically focusing on the steps of production and not the warehousing and the transportation. And as our resources grow, I'd love to pay more attention to that as well. Yeah.
I was actually curious about retail here locally. I know buzzwords right now are emerging designers, local, maybe Brooklyn, even maybe in LA, and these are buzzwords happening in the fashion industry. It's pretty exciting. So I'm just wondering, this retailers locally, how they respond to the product that they're selling at their local stores, and how the customers are responding as well.
We primarily sell actually direct to consumer online because it is more expensive to produce this way, and we want to keep our prices relatively accessible. And so if you cut out the wholesale to retail markup, we kind of pass that back to the consumer. So we pay 2-3 times as much to make our goods as J. Crew pays, but we try and manage relatively get close to their prices, and we do that by avoiding selling through through stores. So I actually don't know. I can't answer your question. I don't know whether they would be wild about us because I haven't really looked into it, but I would hope so. I do think that there's a big trend towards local production, towards this kind of telling the story behind where things come from, and connecting your consumers to the production process. And I think that's just a growing market. I think that's wonderful. All right, I think we probably have time for just one more question. If anyone's had their hand up for a long time and I've been missing them. Sorry, you. Mm-hmm. Waste. That's your question. Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of the waste is actually a lot of the carbon footprint, a lot of the environmental impact is actually on the consumer end rather than the producer end. We do, we make knitwear out of our wool. Knitwear is an inherently low waste process because we do fully fashioned. We don't cut and discard any material in that process. We are cutting and sewing all of our cotton goods, which are coming out this spring, and there is waste there. But again, I think that's sort of an optimizing question, and we're sort of still in the proof of concept stage. I'd love to cut down on waste entirely. But a lot of the waste issue in the apparel industry comes with how quickly people discard their clothing and the kind of fast fashion cycle. And we try to address that by designing stuff that's, you know, relatively basic and long-standing and based on styles that have been around for a long time. So you won't be tempted, you know, there aren't characteristics or attributes of our clothing that are highly stylized that might go out of fashion that would cause you to kind of like, you don't want to wear bell bottoms anymore, you know, you like to throw those away. But we try and kind of stick to these very classic designs where people will keep them in their closets and not throw them away. All right, so I think, is it done? Okay, I think we're over. But thank you all for coming, it's been really fun. I'll be up here if you want to ask questions too. So.